Are live. Cool. And get it up for us real quick. Good to go. So I'm gonna cover Codespaces for Flutter Dev today, and maybe more than a bit more. Let me first just introduce myself. Those of you here know me, but I'm not big on tooting my own horn a whole lot, but I've founded 3 companies since 2006, taking multiple products from 0 to scale. Put some stats up here. My focus is really big data, event streaming, machine learning, AI, SaaS, advertising, and software lifecycle, right? So product ideation to creation to launch to the iterative process of development and evolution, down to, does this product really need to be around anymore? I have 6 granted patents in 2 patent families, which has been an interesting process. And I love building digital products. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an architect. I wanted to build things, or buildings and things that people use. As time went on, I just fell into and discovered software, and now it was malleable, and if the room didn't work out, you changed it, and putting it in an architecture metaphor. And so I've just always enjoyed building things that people use and that feedback process. So let's talk about the agenda for today. I've just done the intro. I'm going to cover Dora and developer experience. You all might think, hey, what does that have to do with Codespaces? We'll get there. We're going to get into GitHub Codespaces, we'll do some demo, talk about challenges, and some tips, and then of course do questions. So in a way, this isn't really a Flutter talk. For me, it's a talk about delivering value, right? And that's product value, customer value, organizational value. There's some code along the way in Dart and some Flutter. So Flutter's there, but more broadly, I think of this topic as related to our key responsibilities as a company. So as a contributor, you deliver value to the customer. As a CTO myself, I deliver value to the team via technical strategy. And as a founder, deliver value to investors in the company. And that delivery of value to the customer is necessary for all of those other goals to succeed, especially in a product-focused company. There's companies out there that are totally internal, but everybody really has a customer, right? Even if you're building internal tools, you have an internal customer. So I think of development and things like the developer experience as part and just the absolute fundamental aspect of improving value delivery. And there is, fortunately, some really well thought out research in the space about what are the aspects of companies that deliver value well, high quality value delivery. And the research is the Dora research. It's the largest and longest running research program of its kind. It seeks to understand the capabilities that drive software delivery and operations performance. Dora helps teams apply those capabilities, leading to better organizational performance. They publish a lot of material. It's well worth reading, even if just to start to get a language, a framework around these topics. Are y'all familiar with Dora at all? Okay. Nope. So it's largely discussed in the realm of CI/CD pipeline kinds of things, DevOps, right? But DevOps taken to its logical should go through the whole stream. And so one of the things they talk about is this value stream concept. And essentially, we focus a lot of times out here in this sort of deployment, and then we spend a lot of time out here in sort of design and then coding. But this process is going on forever in an active product, right? It's this iterative thing. And so what they focus on is metrics around this value stream, getting code written, spec'd, written out the door. With the evolution of things like CI/CD pipelines that are this automated chunk of stuff in the middle, there's been a frustration from developers about the time that takes. So a lot of Dora is focused on like, what do we do to improve that while still maintaining quality? But here, my conversation here, particularly with Codespaces, is like push that left. How do you keep developers productive even before they're feeding into more automated processes? So in Dora metrics, there's two categories and there's two metrics. It's an interesting thing. They've done this research multiple years. They've settled on 4 metrics, right? One of their key things is don't just have one metric. So these are an interrelated set of metrics around throughput and stability. And remember, when we talk about delivery, that can be internal and external. So I know you all are an agency. You may have review periods internally that can be thought of as a delivery before you actually deliver to the customer, and then before you actually deliver to your customers, right? So this process stacks. It works at these different layers. You don't just have to think of it as product launch to production on the web or in the App Store. So in terms of throughput measures the velocity of changes that are being made. And their first metric is change lead time. It's the time it takes for a code commit or change to be successfully deployed. You thought of something that needed to be done, you spec'd it out. How long does it take for that to get out to whatever that next thing, whatever that next definition of deployed is? There's also deployment frequency. How often are application changes deployed? So these two things are just how long does it take once you have the idea, and then how often are you getting things out at all? And I'll get a little bit into some of their philosophy later. And then they talk about stability. Change fail percentage. This is the number of times that a production release fails on a percentage basis. And then fail deployment recovery time. This is how long it takes you to fix it. Their primary recommendation in relation to this is small batch sizes. So essentially releasing as small of changes as you can. Few no orgs are perfect at this. And what does this have to do with the dev environment? What does it have to do with Codespaces? It's my opinion that when you make the developer experience more seamless, when you make the dev environment itself more repeatable, adaptable, dynamic, and more related to the code, then the starting point being more reproducible is what feeds that entire process, right? So think of challenges you've had, you do a launch, something's broken. When you find it immediately, you turn back around to the dev and like, hey, you worked on that feature, and they go, oh, I see it. There's a typo here or something, something simple, right? They fix it and boom, it's out the door. That would really nail these kind of metrics. Yeah, you had a failure, but you fixed it really quickly. Now, like, put a pipeline in the middle of that. So now the fix is 30 minutes or an hour. Or in other cases, let's say it takes you a week to find that. If you have a lot of velocity, a lot of change, now you can be coming back to a developer and saying, hey, you need to fix that. And they could say, our environment changed. Like between now and then, we've changed a piece of the data infrastructure or whatever. So there's more things I need to evolve to in order to fix that. With Codespaces, essentially putting infrastructure, not just for production, but infrastructure for development into your code repo, you make that entire thing, you can just go back to a git commit and boom, the whole thing loads up. If you develop on laptops regularly, you're always kind of juggling environments. If you're using 3 different databases, you're turning them off and on. If anybody's doing things like local Kubernetes or Docker desktop, you're sort of always fighting resources. So writing codes really early in the value flow, step 2 or 3 out of these 15, you should be able to quickly onboard new developers, quickly switch tasks, keep work in small batches, quickly return to previous work, focus more on the task at hand, and focus less on setup and teardown. So one of the things that drives big batches of change in organizations is, well, I got the environment running for this app, this set of resources, so let me just do as much as I can while it's in that state, and then push it, to the next phase of development, push it to test or do whatever. So when those environments are more easily built, now you can work on a small change and know that you can very easily get another environment for the next one. So to get to Codespaces. What are Codespaces? They're instant development environments on GitHub. So there's a bit of configuration in your GitHub repo that when you activate or request a Codespace, tells essentially a GitHub action, if you're familiar with them, in the background to create your Codespace. It's tightly coupled with change control. Once you're in there, you've got all your Git stuff in your user context. It's fully customizable and scalable. You can deploy any number of containers. Basically, I'll get into different sizes and what's available in machines, but it's a pretty wide range. Certainly more powerful than any kind of desktop or even a typical server that you might put in, a development organization. You can access them from anywhere, and you can do things like deploy private and GitHub secured URLs. So your GitHub organization can access the URLs remotely, or you can do fully public for doing reviews and things like that. You can also just keep it totally local. That is how you build or how you define a Codespace. The Docker file that's referenced there, that build Docker file, sits next to this dev container file. And this would build that Docker file, loaded that up as the workspace where your terminal is in VS Code. If you use VS Code locally and use your terminal, it looks exactly like that, except everything you're interacting with is remote. And it's completely seamless. So it forwards ports. And to me, it feels almost exactly like local dev. Unless you've got a real flaky internet connection, it's pretty seamless. What all can it do? So there is an established spec for dev containers. It's Microsoft's thing, and now was GitHub, now Microsoft's thing, but they are trying to get it adopted by other environments. So I think there is some support. It uses Docker Compose, so all the Docker Compose functionality is available. Are y'all familiar with Docker Compose at all?
A little bit.
So, you kind of think of like a container running locally on your machine, then Docker Compose as like an orchestration layer that focuses really on just service connectivity. And then you get to like a Kubernetes where it's more about like service isolation and then security abstraction across that. So Compose doesn't really deal with like the security layer other than just like raw access to the machine or port availability. But it deals with really just how the services or the parts of the app interact. There's a lot of functionality around that. It layers on top of that event lifecycles for the containers. So you can do things like run a script inside of them when they start up, run a script inside of them when they're created. And so it lets you do some things like essentially define this Docker file for your dev environment, and then additional dev-related things like spinning up database schemas or loading test data or loading seeders and things like that, and then separating that from the Docker Compose file itself, which gives you a nice template as you promote this through environments, getting towards productionizing that Docker file more easily, because it doesn't have quite as much dev-related stuff in it. They support a bunch of common containers with common development environments, but technically pretty much any Docker, anything you can run in Docker can be run, except there's a couple of things that want like CPUs that aren't available, or CPU type underlying that aren't available. There's a bunch of plugins and features. I'll show a couple of those in a minute. You can do shared secrets at the repo and org level. So they get brought in as environment variables, but their life cycle is only for whatever your access is. And so then they can be managed at the org level and rotated and all of that. People always ask, well, then can't people see it? Well, then it's the same people you would have given it to in any other case. But what you have is the ability to rotate them out, remove them, and that sort of thing. And the developers don't have to manage that separately. You don't have to ask them to get rid of it. You can create a new dev environment in minutes. One of the things when we get into the demo, it does take like 20 minutes to build one of these things. You got to build a Docker file. So it doesn't demo very well, but I've got it already done in the background. So awesome. You can connect via any desktop or web browser. You can connect on your phone, technically, if you want to deal with the ergonomics of that. They go from 2 cores to, I think, 32 cores, up to 64 gigs of RAM, 32 gigs of storage. They have GPU support. You can do a lot on it. They do pre-builds as well, so once you've got a stable development environment, you can have it run like every morning at 9 a.m., 6 a.m. or whatever. People come in, they fire them up to do the day's work, and they're not having to run that 20-minute build process. Probably takes about 5 minutes at that point. We spend about $50 per month per dev running dev environments that are anywhere from 4 to 8 cores. So it's pretty efficient from a monetary perspective. If you're running GPUs, of course, it's going to run up, but it's pretty cost efficient. So let me talk a little bit about how we've leveraged Codespaces. We've really found Codespaces to be a natural flow to a more advanced CI/CD, and then later to a Kubernetes deployment, a Docker Swarm deployment. In a lot of cases, we've actually settled on Docker Swarm as our deployment environment because it really meets our requirements, and the additional things that Kubernetes layers on, we don't need. All of our apps are internal, we don't have multiple layers of test, dev, and these sorts of things. So our goal was to containerize 6 apps and move them to Kubernetes or Docker Swarm. The key here was we simplified dev onboarding, we made dev reproducible, and we did all of the containerization work in a nice dev environment. And then when we said, okay, we got to take this and move it to Kubernetes or move it to Docker Swarm, we had the model. Is it exactly the same? No, but it's real close. And you're not having to kind of fight the extra complexity of a production-like environment for Docker Swarm, or even a more complex environment like a Kubernetes Lite or something like that. So we found it to be an effective first step along the path to more robust integration and deployment. So let me demo a little bit. So this is a dev container. This is a GitHub Codespace. And like I said, there's some challenges demoing it because it just looks like a VS Code Codespace, right? But it's a container defined by this Docker file. And what I've done for the purposes of this demo is I've based it on Microsoft's dev container base. And this gives some things like some users, like a user called VS Code, and some niceties around, are y'all familiar in general with containers, commands, and entry points? It gives some commands and entry point sort of stuff that just makes things work. And I'll get into some things early on that we kind of beat our heads against and some tips later. But and then I'm just installing Dart and Flutter. And then doing some things to fix up permissions. I'm sure if I knew Flutter a little better, some of these things would be, well, I know the better way around it, but I got it working. Mm-hmm. The nice thing here was that, once it's working, I'll never have to figure that out again. And I'll never have to explain it to anyone. Essentially, if someone else came along and said, "Hey, Steven, I'm going to work on this Flutter app," I just point them at the repo. They create a branch. They create the code space, and now they can just focus on the component that they need to. They don't have to figure out like, okay, I need a CMake plugin or Clang and stuff. So it's the other thing you get. I'm 100% sure it's working. Yeah. So you can do Docker in Docker, which lets you actually build Docker images right in here, test out that they work. So one of the nice things is kind of like a nice workflow component is, if I want to make a change to that Docker file, I can actually do and then set the context to here. I can verify that it builds, right? And you can do all of that right in the code space. Then once I have a version of that builds, I can rebuild the whole container. I can take the 20 minutes to verify if I needed to add another package or do something like that. So now that I'm here, I'll get into a couple of the challenges later. Device emulation is still a trick here. And I didn't solve it all. And the part of my goal here was to sort of learn Flutter. I already knew Codespaces, and then kind of like merge those two together and talk to you all about this. So the if we go in to our app, this is the simplest of apps. I found some Code Academy demo or something. But we get all of our nice run and debug just like we would on the desktop. I've already set it to be web-based instead of device-based. It's going to pop up in the wrong place. Give it a second. So this port is forwarded to the code space to interact with the server that started up when I started running debug. And now that I'm here, I'll start the Flutter debugger. Real enough. I'm not here to show off Flutter as much as talk about it in relation to Codespace. So, but you get all of the things, live update and all the rest. I'm sure you guys have probably seen this sample like 100 times. So you get, live update, live reload, and all of that, and all that basic tooling. That's really the Flutter demo to this point. But let me talk about some advanced kind of aspects of Codespaces and how it might interact. So let's say you've got needs on the back end, Redis, MySQL, whatever your data stores are. You can do things like take this dev container and make it a little more complex. Instead of referencing a Docker file, you reference an entire Docker compose. And then that Docker compose can have all sorts of resources. And so, using a basic database and just giving it dev-related passwords, it's all local, right? Creating databases, I've got FluentBit in here, which basically log collection or event collection, and FluentD and Redis and Aerospike. All those things would be, if I ran this and built the dev container around it, or the code space around it, would be loaded up in here, and I would be like, this workspace and terminal would be a machine in that Docker Compose stack of services. So Aerospike could be referenceable as Aerospike and things like that. There's a couple other things this shows. You can do like these onCreate commands, and there's a series of lifecycle things on start, on create, on load. There's ones related to like actually building the container, and there's other ones related to starting it up when you log in, basically. You can forward different ports. So you've got the Docker compose. If you don't define ports, you only have internal connectivity. This lets you forward only a certain set of ports is available through the proxy. You can give them labels for other purposes. This features, if you're using a dev container image that's already built, then you can layer on things easily and you don't have to figure out how to set them all up in Docker. And this is part of the thing, it's like the difference between creating dev environments and creating production environments, right? In that production environment, you would craft exactly what was there. In the dev environment, you might need Node for some reason. You might need Go for some reason. And so features let you just kind of toss those things in, not worry about how they're configured exactly or how exactly they're loaded. The underlying thing will actually figure out which version of Linux you're running and install the right packages and things like that. You can define extensions the same way you would in your Codespace file or your VS Code files. Basically, you can tell the system or the person loading this, you're probably going to need these plugins. So you can do all that. And this is like a more advanced version of on create file. And this is, when this is created, it goes ahead and creates some things like empty database schemas or pre-seeded schemas, maybe they have sample data or whatever, and then goes all the way to the point of doing Laravel migrations and seeders and those sorts of things. The idea being, you load this up, you don't have to figure that out. You don't have to ask anybody, well, what's the command to seed this particular app? So that is that. So let's just talk about a couple of challenges specifically for Flutter. Device simulation, one of the better solutions sounded like actually doing tailscale of some sort and getting a network running. People talked about all sorts of things related to A to B port forwarding. To me, looking at it for the sort of thing, I was just like, I'll run a web version for as long as possible. I'll get a local version. I'll build it and put it on my device. Just doing a two-step kind of thing. Firebase is supported, can be kind of tricky. There's a bunch of solutions on Google. Tips. When you're starting out, build your actual Codespace containers locally. The process of doing it through the GitHub UI or through VS Code, starting it is called a rebuild, just has like a bunch of things that are just an extra few seconds. And so you hit build, it takes a few minutes for the runner to even start, for VS Code to go through its thing. That takes 45 seconds. And then you might just have a typo and it fails, right? And you would know that instantly if you just did a Docker build locally. The other thing is, your initial dev container should be kind of free of encumbrance to local resources. You really should be doing that in a script. So if you do it like somewhere completely separate, then you aren't pulling in a bunch of like repo local stuff that kind of maybe shouldn't be getting into the initial setup. Use the base images from dev container repo as a starting point. If you build a custom container, you can do a command sleep infinity. You need a workspace. It's the thing where your terminal sits. So if you don't have one of the bases that they already have, you need to tell it run forever. I probably spent like 2 hours trying to figure out why my containers just kept, like the base of the Codespace just always went into an error state. And it was because it was doing exactly what I asked it to. It ran for 3 seconds and stopped. And so there's also depends on where, you can do all of make sure the database is running before you start up front ends. Use pre-builds, saves a ton of time once you get going. Once the dev environment is pretty stable, pre-build it. It'll save a lot of time. So, roll it back. Improving developer experience improves DORA metrics. The DORA metrics relates to improved value delivery. Greater value to the customer more quickly at higher quality is why we're all here. It's a win-win, and it works for Flutter too. So, there we go.
That was an awesome presentation. I do have at least 3 questions.
Cool.
So, first one, saw your Docker container was Ubuntu.
Yeah.
Is there any option for Mac OS? Mainly just to like for Xcode builds.
Yeah. I don't think so.
Okay.
And all of the Linux variants are the ones that I see, and there's something with underlying CPU availability and relation, because I think it's you'd have to explore it.
Yeah.
I don't do Xcode development.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't be surprised if Apple was getting in the way of that a little bit.
Yeah.
So
Next question was, what was I going to say? Is there anything with like I/O port forwarding, where like I could, I don't know how it would work honestly, but like if I plugged in a USB device for your GitHub Codespace to recognize it.
yeah, not that I know of.
Okay.
If it's available through some sort of port-based communication, like a TCP/IP communication, or you can make it, then probably. But you're also talking about like a local device with remote, and like that direction is not as clear as the inbound.
Yeah.
That would be interesting to find out. Depending on what's on the USB, you can load into the container. You can mount things that are available in the code space. So there's probably something you can do.
Okay.
At some point in the workflow. It's just not something I've done.
Okay.
So,
And then the last one, and you kind of showed an example of this, like for us, right? We have probably a couple projects that this might make sense to implement, and the reason it would most make sense for us to implement is I'm a Flutter developer, right? I'm not a Laravel developer.
Yeah.
But we might have an app that uses a Laravel backend.
Yeah.
And because I don't do Laravel development, I don't have maybe the exact version of PHP I need, or the exact version of Laravel, or all those things installed. So you could essentially use this to spin up and auto seed and do all those things with a Laravel environment very easily, and then use that to interact with a Flutter app against it.
Absolutely.
Right? Okay.
Yeah, your Flutter app can be local because you've now got an exposed port to hit that essentially looks like whatever domain / you would normally use, just local port /, right? Absolutely. And I think that really speaks to one of the really great use cases here, which is, when you get into development, you kind of understand development, right? And so even if you needed to do something quickly in that Laravel app to support what you're doing on the Flutter side that you know better, usually the impediment to you doing that is actually setting the thing up.
Yeah.
It's not writing the code. Like, you would know how to figure that out. It's actually setting it up.
Yeah.
And then that takes let me go find the expert. And so now you're bothering them. And so I think that kind of use is really great for it.
Yeah.
Because you, as not the primary developer, aren't going to come in and make a bunch of architectural changes.
Yeah.
But it certainly would improve things if you just knew an API change needed to be made in order to support what you're doing on the front end.
Yeah.
So,
I think the last question I have, when you were showing it, it looks like it's running through just VS Code on your computer. Are you actually like in VS Code and hitting something that's like connect to GitHub Codespace, or is that?
Yeah, so I can actually demo that a little bit. So if I go in, so you can go right here and say create, and it's actually just going to load up VS Code.
Okay.
I have a pre-build, and so I should get.
So it prompts to open VS Code and
Prompts to open VS Code and then just cranks it up.
Okay.
And so then I can kind of monitor its progression.
And I saw somewhere you had listed out extensions that you wanted on this. So this is not going to use my local extensions unless I add that whole list of all of them.
You can load essentially the stack of stuff now includes recommendations from the dev container.
Okay, so it does have all of my...
And it would have yours too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's nice.
And you could do a combination of like, you can basically tell it not to load the dev container ones. There's choices within config to do the whole like, what do I really want to happen? You absolutely can load. Sometimes you need to, it says this plugin, this extension must run in the dev container. So you got to do like a reload.
Yeah.
But that's something about just like where some of the code lives in order to make the whole thing work.
That was my biggest woe with Project IDX, and I don't know if you looked at that at all, but that's Google's kind of version of this, but way less intense. I think easier to spin up, not as much customizability, but it looks just like VS Code because it's built on top of VS Code, but no support for extensions. And I'm like, I can't use it then if I can't have all of my fancy extensions.
once you get hooked on them,
yeah,
you want them. And one of the things it does, if you'll see in here, if I go, it actually basically monitors this folder. So if I come in here and say, this will be a silly example, but, and actually it says like, we noticed a change to your dev container.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you then, you can, and then you get an option to rebuild, full rebuild, and things like that.
Gotcha.
So it's pretty smart about telling you like, hey, I changed something. You can configure pre-builds to be built when it detects a code change or a change in the dev container too.
Gotcha.
So there's some niceties certainly around it.
Is there an advantage, I guess? I feel like people have thought about this for a while, and they first went after it with gaming, with like Stadia, where it was like the hardware is in the cloud somewhere, you can connect on any device, and then you never have to care about the device you're on, the power of it. So like, of course, every couple of years we have to upgrade everyone in our company's Macs. If we're all fine with how these look, essentially you would never have to do that, right? Unless it broke.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm doing is like, you know, it used to be I'd say, well, I want to try out our new version of Golang.
Yeah.
Right? And with this, I don't have to figure out like, okay, am I working on something that if I break it, my laptop that there's going to be a real problem for a little while. I just fire up a Codespace in a new repo, or the one the project's in on a branch. It takes 2 minutes to get to the current version, and then I just change the version, or I update a package, or do whatever, and see how it's running. And I can do that in 10 projects sequentially without futzing around with it. So yes, I mean, like, if I start a new project or I want to do a new little scripting thing in PHP or whatever, I'll just fire up a Codespace and start playing around in the corner of one.
Yeah.
And I used to have WSL, and I used to have GitHub Desktop, and I used to have a version of Kubernetes running on the machine, and like all this stuff. It's one of the reasons I have a more powerful laptop than I now need. And actually now I'm going, okay, well, I need to get more portable.
Yeah.
A lighter machine, because all my development's being done remotely.
Yeah. That's interesting. Could save a whole lot of money on laptops. Get a little Linux box.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, and it really does. So I mean, I showed. It gets a little even. Gets a little beyond that. Let's see. There's a way. I don't do this very often. But there's a way to say. I'm just missing the thing, but you can actually do it in the browser.
Okay.
So. It's on this part. There's a way to tell it to create the Codespace in the browser, and just use the browser editor.
That's
awesome.
awesome.
So like you wouldn't even, you could do it on a Chromebook.
Yeah. Yeah.
That doesn't even have local storage.
Or like you said, even an iPad or something like that.
Yeah. So I mean, it's pretty interesting, and the VS Code that runs in the browser is pretty capable. There's a couple of quirks.
Yeah, I've used it
But
for
it
pull
works.
requests, which is really nice.
Yeah.
What is the story behind your GitHub profile picture, the Viking?
Oh, yeah. So the first company I started in 2006, the graphic designer that we hired, his high school and college job was he did caricatures at a local amusement park. And so we had him do caricatures of all the employees. And we started using them as our profiles. It was a gaming company, so it was totally on brand. And then I used to joke, when we scaled up one of our companies, we hired some people, I gave everybody the same hat, the Viking hats. And I used to tell everybody, my version of Move Fast and Break Things was, we'll burn that bridge when we get to it. And, it was just this sort of Viking mentality. So that's very nice.
Are you allowed to say what your exit was? Like what the company was?
I sold Game Skinny
Okay.
to a group in Australia called Gamers.
Okay.
So,
Awesome.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
Well, we have a couple of announcements that I've never been on camera before.
Do you have any questions from the live stream? I don't know if you're looking. Let me see.
We don't.
I think we're good. Perfect.
Cool. Well, Stephen, thank you
Thanks for having me.
being here. We'll have you on again sometime. That
Cool.
was awesome. For everyone on the stream and for history's sake, next month, July 11th, right? We'll be talking about Project IDX. Emmett will be talking about Project IDX. Got a little sneak preview there. And then 2 conferences coming up that I just want to mention to the community. FlutterCon is up in New York City. That's going to be September 19th and 20th. Flutter ATL is a community sponsor of that, so we got in on the community there. And we will at some point be getting a discount code, so if you want to go, I can't help you with travel, but I can help with the registration fee, which is going to be awesome. And then we have Connect Tech, which is going to be right here in Atlanta, November 18th through the 20th, so you got plenty of time to think about that one. But that one's big, one of the largest multi-framework front-end conferences in the US, and up until now they had not supported Flutter. So this is the first year that they are even bringing Flutter into the conversation. So that is awesome, and we will have discount codes to that as well.
Cool.
But we've got plenty of time for that. So we'll see all of you next month, July 11th. We're out.
And we're out.
And now we're out.
See.
Awesome, thank you.